Hi, it's Friday and time to look back at what happened at Queen's Park in Ontario politics this week, 6 months out from the provincial election. The Auditor General of Ontario's reports were released this week. The PC government announces various policies in a continued move towards the political centre. The putting limits on ministerial zoning orders was in the news, and the Auditors General's of Ontario's fight to dig into why Laurentian University declared bankruptcy heats up. The Auditor General looked at various things in her report. One of them was the small business support grants that came out earlier this year. There were two $10,000 grants available. The Auditor General said that ineligible businesses got about $200 million, and businesses with small losses got $700 million too much. The government responded by saying that $200 million was only 7% of the total sum spent on supporting small business during the shutdown from the pandemic. The goal was to get money out the door quickly to save businesses, according to the government. And the government said that the Auditor General only looked at small business losses for 1 month, the month that was used to evaluate eligibility, instead of over the whole pandemic period, when comparing the size of the small business grant money to the losses suffered by businesses. From the Auditor General's report, it looks like the grant was put together very quickly, however, only over a few days in December of 2020, 9 months after the economy shut down. It looks like if Premier Ford's government had been more proactive in the previous 9 months instead of just reactive, the public service would have had time to design something a little more effective and less wasteful. Premier Ford's PC government moves towards the political center in the advance of elections. Premier Ford stopped the previous Liberal government's plan for electric vehicle charging stations soon after being elected in 2018. But this week, the government announced a restart of the plan to install EV charging station at the en route stations on the 401. The Ford government canceled the Liberal minimum wage increase, and this recently announced an increase to the minimum wage to $15 an hour starting January the 1st. The 4 hours of per day of care in long-term care homes, which was in the previous government's 2018 election platform, is now a PC government policy. And this week it was announced that Infrastructure Ontario loan guarantees for not-for-profit long-term care homes, and that's lower interest rate costs for building not-for-profit long-term care homes, because they will be given quality not-for-profit home projects will be given the province's credit rating, and hence lower interest rate costs. And the government passed workers' rights legislation. You know, it's good. Province before party. It's great that the governing party is moving towards the positions of the other parties. I think that opposition parties should just keep up the pressure, explaining where the PC government is wrong or could do better to help Ontarians even before the election. Ministerial zoning orders were in the news. Now, if you've ever wanted to put up a building or maybe oppose some aspect of a build, you've been involved in the planning process. An MZO, Ministerial Zoning Order, allows a project to bypass all of that. So the week started with Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca proposing to put limits on MZOs, using them mostly to fast-track affordable housing and not-for-profit long-term care homes, and definitely not to circumvent environmental reviews. And noting that the current government has issued 57 MZOs in 3.5 years, whereas the previous governments issued only 15 over 15 years. The Premier Ford's government responded that some of the MZOs that it issued were for affordable housing and for long-term care beds. In particular, in Kingston, a veterans tiny home community was given a ministerial zoning order so it can bypass the planning process. Later this week, Later in the week, the Auditor General said in her report that we do need some rules around the use of MZOs as a check on the potential abuse of this power, and I agree. And finally, the Auditor General and Laurentian University were in the news. In February of 2021, Laurentian University filed for essentially bankruptcy. They got protection under a federal act known as CCAA. The result was that they could close down a lot of programs, lay off lots of faculty and staff. In April of 2021, the Ontario legislature told the Ontario Auditor General to look at the period 2010 to 2020 and find out what happened. There's now a controversy over whether the provincial government allowed the university to go bankrupt in order to more easily cut programs, lay off staff, get the province off the hook for paying to keep them going. This Wednesday, the Auditor General put out a special update separate from the end-of-year report, basically saying that Laurentian was not cooperating with the audit. The university said it did not have to disclose privileged information. This is the basic legal principle that discussions between a lawyer and the client must remain confidential. They're even going to court, the Auditor General and the university, over this issue. Now the Auditor General has been criticized for being wrong in the past, for not admitting it, and for seeking media attention, but it would be really useful to get an independent assessment of what happened at Laurentian. Funding for post-secondary institutions is going to be an issue in the years to come. I'm thinking about Queen's and St. Lawrence College locally, so we really need to dig deep enough so that Laurentian can teach us some lessons. And lastly, I want to just mention that Ontario has passed a milestone this week, 10,000 deaths from COVID. It is a tragedy worth pausing to note. We should resolve to learn from it and to never forget to prepare for the inevitable next pandemic. Tell me what you think in the comments below and join me next week as I look back at what happened at Ontario politics and Queen's Park.